What if the most consequential rivalry of the 21st century was not decided on a battlefield, but in a boardroom, a laboratory, a shipping lane, and a semiconductor factory? For decades, the United States and China have circled each other like two great tectonic plates, each shift sending tremors across the entire world. One is the incumbent superpower, the architect of a global order built after World War II. The other is the fastest rising nation in human history, determined to reclaim what it calls its rightful place at the center of civilization. This is not simply a trade war. It is not simply a tech rivalry. It is a contest over who will write the rules of the world for the next 100 years, and both sides know it. From Nixon's secret flight to Beijing, to the factories of Shenzhen, to the contested waters of the South China Sea, to the chip labs of Silicon Valley and Taiwan. This is the story of America's global strategy toward China, a strategy that has shifted, stumbled, recalibrated, and hardened, a strategy whose outcome will shape the lives of every person on Earth. The architecture of engagement, how America built the dragon it now fears. To understand America's strategy toward China today, you must first understand the strategy that came before it, a strategy rooted not in confrontation, but in a profound and ultimately controversial bet. The bet was this: if the United States brought China into the global economic order, if it opened its markets, transferred technology, granted access to international institutions, and welcomed China's rise as a trading partner, then China would liberalize. It would grow wealthier, and wealth would produce a middle class, and a middle class would demand political freedom, and political freedom would gradually transform the Communist Party of China into something more like a responsible stakeholder in the American-led international system. It was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential strategic gambles in the history of American foreign policy. And by the early 2020s, most serious analysts, on both the left and the right, had concluded that it had failed. But the story does not begin in failure. It begins in the most unlikely of diplomatic moments. February 1972, when President Richard Nixon stepped off Air Force One onto the tarmac in Beijing. Nixon, the Cold War hawk, the man who had built his career on anti-communism, was shaking hands with Premier Zhou Enlai in front of the cameras of the world. The symbolism was staggering. The United States was formally acknowledging the People's Republic of China. The Shanghai Communique, signed at the end of the visit, did not resolve the fundamental disagreements between the two countries, particularly over Taiwan, but it opened a channel. And that channel, over the following decades, would become a highway. The normalization of diplomatic relations came fully in 1979 under President Jimmy Carter. With it came the opening of trade. American corporations began looking at China with the eyes of gold rush prospectors. Here was a nation of nearly 1 billion people, a labor force of almost incomprehensible scale, willing to work for wages that made American manufacturing costs look absurd. The logic of globalization and comparative advantage pointed toward China with the force of gravity. Throughout the 1980s, trade between the two nations grew steadily. But the pivotal moment, the hinge of history, came in 2001 when China was admitted to the World Trade Organization. The United States was the decisive advocate for China's entry. The Clinton administration had championed permanent normal trade relations with China through Congress in 2000, over fierce opposition from labor unions and some human rights groups. The argument was explicit: trade would transform China. Economic integration would do what Cold War pressure never could. The invisible hand of the market would open the closed fist of the Communist Party. What followed was a transformation of global manufacturing on a scale never before seen. Between 2001 and 2018, the United States lost approximately 3.7 million manufacturing jobs, with economists David Dorn, and Gordon Hanson documenting what they called the China shock, the devastating impact on American factory communities that globalization's proponents had either failed to anticipate or chosen to ignore. Entire towns in the American Midwest and South, places that had built cars, made furniture, stitched clothing, hollowed out. The factories went to Guangdong, to Fujian, to the Pearl River Delta, where millions of workers assembled the product that American consumers bought at Walmart and Target and Best Buy. Meanwhile, China was not simply becoming a cheaper version of itself. It was learning. Every joint venture forced on foreign companies entering the Chinese market came with technology transfer requirements, formal or informal. Every factory built on Chinese soil became a training ground. The Chinese state was strategic about industrialization in a way that Western market orthodoxy had not anticipated or had chosen to dismiss as inefficient. The Made in China 2025 plan, announced in 2015, made the strategy explicit. China intended to dominate the 10 industries of the future, from electric vehicles to artificial intelligence to aerospace to biotechnology. This was not the behavior of a nation being peacefully integrated into an American-designed order. This was the behavior of a nation designing its own order. The human rights dimension further complicated the picture. The Tiananmen Square massacre of June 1989, where the Chinese government crushed pro-democracy protests with tanks and soldiers, killing hundreds or possibly thousands of civilians, produced a brief period of Western sanctions. But the sanctions did not last. Within a few years, the business of business resumed. American presidents from Bush to Clinton to Bush to Obama delivered speeches about human rights in China, met with dissidents at the White House, expressed concern about Tibet and Xinjiang and the treatment of Falun Gong practitioners, and then flew to Beijing to sign trade deals. The message that China absorbed from this pattern was clear. Economic relations were too valuable to sacrifice for human rights principles. The principles were rhetorical. The money was real. By the time Xi Jinping consolidated power in 2012 and 2013, eliminating term limits, centralizing authority in his own hands, and launching an ideology campaign that required every Chinese citizen and institution to demonstrate loyalty to the party, the assumptions behind the engagement strategy were crumbling. She was not liberalizing China. He was reversing the limited liberalization of the Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin eras. The internet, which American tech optimists had once predicted would be an unstoppable force for freedom in China, was instead being shaped into the most sophisticated surveillance and censorship infrastructure in human history. The Great Firewall blocked Google, Facebook, Twitter, and Western news sources. The social credit system, though more fragmented and varied in practice than its dystopian reputation, signaled an intention to use digital technology for social control rather than social emancipation. The engagement strategy was not simply failing. In the eyes of its critics, it had actively subsidized the rise of an authoritarian system that was now capable of projecting power in ways that directly threatened American interests, American allies, and the American-led international order. The question was no longer whether to engage. The question was how to compete, and whether America had left it too late. The pivot, the trade war, and the breaking point. The first serious signal that American strategic thinking about China was undergoing a fundamental shift came not from a Republican hawk, but from a Democratic president. Barack Obama's pivot to Asia, announced in 2011 and elaborated through 2012, was a geopolitical reorientation that acknowledged, however diplomatically, what many analysts had long argued, that the center of gravity of global affairs was shifting to the Indo-Pacific and that the United States needed to concentrate more of its military, diplomatic, and economic attention on that theater. The pivot involved deploying additional naval assets to the region, strengthening alliances with Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines, and launching the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a massive trade agreement deliberately constructed to exclude China and to set the trade rules of the Asia-Pacific region on American rather than Chinese terms. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was, in retrospect, one of the most significant strategic instruments America never actually deployed. Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the agreement on his third day in office in January 2017, fulfilling a campaign promise to both his base of industrial workers who feared free trade and to economic nationalists who saw any multilateral agreement as a surrender of sovereignty. The withdrawal from the TPP handed China a strategic gift of enormous value. Within months, Beijing was accelerating its own regional trade architecture, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which it eventually signed in 2020, creating the world's largest trading bloc and cementing Chinese economic centrality in precisely the region that American strategy had sought to contest. But Trump's broader approach to China was not simply a retreat from multilateralism. It was a deliberate escalation, framed in the language of economic nationalism, that permanently altered the trajectory of the bilateral relationship. In 2018, the Trump administration launched a series of tariffs on Chinese goods that triggered a full-scale trade war. The initial justification was the enormous bilateral trade deficit. The United States imported vastly more from China than it exported, and what the administration characterized as China's unfair trade practices, currency manipulation, forced technology transfer, intellectual property theft, and state subsidies that allowed Chinese companies to undercut American competitors. The tariffs escalated in waves. By the end of 2019, the United States had imposed tariffs on approximately $370 billion worth of Chinese goods. China retaliated with tariffs on American agricultural exports, targeting the soybean farmers of the Midwest and the corn farmers of the Great Plains, constituencies that had voted heavily for Trump and now found their livelihoods threatened by the trade war their president had started. The economic damage was real on both sides, but the underlying strategic logic, forcing China to abandon its mercantilist model through economic pressure, proved difficult to achieve in a single presidential term. What emerged from the trade war, however, was something more durable than any specific tariff schedule. A bipartisan consensus in Washington that the era of engagement was over and that China represented a strategic competitor of the First Order. This consensus was remarkable in its breadth. Republicans and Democrats, hawks and doves, free traders and protectionists, all converged on the view that the relationship with China needed to be fundamentally restructured. The specific policies they proposed differed, but the underlying diagnosis was shared. The American political class had concluded, collectively, that it had made a historic error, and that correction was urgently required. The technology dimension of this competition became particularly sharp during the Trump years, crystallized in the campaign against Huawei. Huawei, the Chinese telecommunications giant, had become the world's largest manufacturer of telecommunications equipment and one of the leading smartphone brands globally. American intelligence agencies had long warned that Huawei's equipment, embedded in the telecommunications networks of dozens of countries, could potentially provide the Chinese government with surveillance access to critical communications infrastructure. Whether or not those specific warnings were accurate in every case, the broader concern they reflected was genuine, that China's rise as a technology superpower had created deep vulnerabilities in the digital infrastructure of the Western world. The Trump administration moved against Huawei with extraordinary force. It placed Huawei on the entity list, cutting the company off from American semiconductor technology and software. It pressured allies to exclude Huawei from their 5G networks, a campaign that achieved significant success in the United Kingdom, Australia, Sweden, and other countries, though less so in parts of continental Europe. It extradited, or rather, sought the extradition of Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou from Canada, a move that triggered a diplomatic crisis with Beijing and the detention of two Canadian citizens in China in apparent retaliation. The Huawei confrontation was a preview of the technology decoupling that would define the following years. Perhaps most consequentially, the Trump administration released a national security strategy in 2017 that explicitly named China as a strategic competitor and a revisionist power seeking to displace the United States in the Indo-Pacific region and reshape the international order in its favor. This was a categorical departure from the language of every previous American national security document, which had either avoided naming China as a threat or had framed it as a potential partner. The 2017 document made the competitive nature of the relationship official and permanent, in the sense that it established a framework that subsequent administrations would build upon rather than dismantle. The technology war, chips, AI, and the battle for the future. If the trade war of 2018 to 2020 was a confrontation over the present, over who made televisions and soybeans and steel, then the technology confrontation that followed was a war over the future. Specifically, it was a war over the semiconductor, the microscopic integrated circuit that powers every meaningful technology of the 21st century. Smartphones, fighter jets, autonomous vehicles, artificial intelligence servers, precision-guided missiles, and the data centers that now run the global economy. Whoever controls the semiconductor supply chain controls the technological future. And by the early 2020s, both Washington and Beijing understood this with a clarity that drove policy in ways that would have seemed extraordinary a decade earlier. The semiconductor industry had developed, over 50 years, into one of the most complex and geographically concentrated supply chains in human history. The design of leading-edge chips was dominated by American companies: Intel, Qualcomm, NVIDIA, AMD, Apple. The equipment required to manufacture those chips was produced almost entirely by three companies: ASML in the Netherlands, Applied Materials in the United States, and Tokyo Electron in Japan. The actual fabrication of the most advanced chips, using a process so precise that its tolerances are measured in atoms, was concentrated in a single company on a single island, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company on Taiwan. TSMC manufactured chips for virtually every major technology company in the world, including American companies, Chinese companies, European companies, and South Korean companies. Its fabs in Hsinchu and Tainan were, in a very real sense, the most strategically important factories on Earth. The Biden administration, entering office in January 2021, inherited the technology confrontation with China and intensified it with a policy coherence and multilateral sophistication that the Trump administration had often lacked. The signature move came in October 2022, the export controls on advanced computing and semiconductors, a sweeping set of restrictions that went far beyond anything previously attempted. The controls cut off China's access not merely to advanced American chips. They extended to any chip manufactured anywhere in the world using American equipment, software, or design tools. Since American technology was embedded at virtually every node of the global semiconductor supply chain, this effectively meant that no company anywhere on Earth could sell advanced chips to China without an American license. The Dutch government, under pressure from Washington, subsequently restricted ASML from exporting its most advanced extreme ultraviolet lithography machines to China. Japan imposed similar controls on its semiconductor equipment manufacturers. The stated goal was to prevent China from acquiring the computing power necessary to develop advanced military applications, particularly artificial intelligence systems that could be used for surveillance, autonomous weapons, or electronic warfare. The unstated implication was broader: to keep China at least a generation behind the technological frontier in the industries that would determine military and economic power in the coming decades. Critics argued that the controls would accelerate China's drive towards semiconductor self-sufficiency, that they would damage American companies that relied on China for revenue, and that they would push China toward more aggressive behavior out of a sense of strategic encirclement. Proponents argued that without the controls, China would simply purchase its way to technological parity and then use that parity to coerce its neighbors and challenge American military supremacy. The Chinese response was exactly what the critics had predicted and the proponents had discounted as insufficient. Beijing launched a massive state-directed investment campaign in domestic semiconductor manufacturing. The China Integrated Circuit Industry Investment Fund, known as the Big Fund, channeled hundreds of billions of yuan into domestic chip production. SMIC, China's leading chip maker, accelerated development of more advanced manufacturing processes. In August 2023, Huawei released a new smartphone, the Mate 60 Pro, powered by a domestically manufactured 7-nanometer chip, a development that shocked American analysts who had believed China was years away from that capability. The chip was not competitive with the leading-edge 3-nanometer and 2-nanometer processes being developed by TSMC and Samsung, but it demonstrated that American export controls, while damaging, had not stopped Chinese progress. The artificial intelligence dimension of the technology war added another layer of strategic urgency. The launch of ChatGPT in November 2022 and the subsequent explosion of generative AI development made clear that artificial intelligence would transform not just consumer products but military capabilities, intelligence analysis, economic productivity, and national power in ways that were difficult to fully predict but impossible to ignore. China had invested heavily in AI research throughout the 2010s and had produced world-class AI companies: Baidu, ByteDance, SenseTime, and others. The competition between American and Chinese AI systems was not simply commercial. It was a contest for the dominant technological paradigm of the coming era. NVIDIA's H100 GPU chips, the most powerful commercially available accelerator for training large AI models, became the oil of the AI economy. American export controls targeted the H100 and its successors specifically, attempting to prevent China from accumulating the computing clusters necessary to train frontier AI models. China responded by attempting to develop domestic alternatives, by stockpiling chips before the controls took effect, and by exploring whether less powerful chips could be used in aggregate to approximate the capabilities of restricted hardware. The race was not simply technological. It was organizational, economic, and geopolitical, involving the research universities, the venture capital networks, the immigration policies, and the regulatory environments of both countries. The Taiwan question lay beneath all of this like a geological fault. Taiwan was not simply a democratic success story and a close American partner. It was the irreplaceable linchpin of the global semiconductor supply chain. A Chinese military seizure of Taiwan would not merely be a humanitarian catastrophe and a geopolitical shock. It would potentially give China control over the most strategically critical manufacturing capacity on Earth. American policy, strategic ambiguity over whether it would militarily defend Taiwan, was being tested by China's increasingly aggressive military posturing around the island, including large-scale military exercises in August 2022 following House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taipei. The technology war and the Taiwan question had fused into a single strategic dilemma of the highest order. Alliances, the Indo-Pacific, and the shape of the coming order. The most fundamental question in American strategy toward China is not whether to compete, or how hard to compete on technology, or what tariffs to impose on what goods. The most fundamental question is whether the United States can build and sustain a coalition of countries capable of balancing Chinese power, and whether the international order that emerges from this competition will be governed by rules that protect smaller nations, or by the logic of raw power that historically has favored the strong over the weak. This is the question that determines whether the 21st century produces a stable multipolar equilibrium or a period of great power conflict whose consequences are unimaginable. American alliance strategy in the Indo-Pacific has accelerated dramatically since 2017. The Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, the Quad, comprising the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, was revived and elevated to the level of heads of government summits. The Quad does not describe itself as a military alliance and does not have a mutual defense treaty, but it represents a convergence of strategic interests among four major democratic powers with significant shared concerns about Chinese behavior in the Indo-Pacific. Its working groups on technology, vaccines, infrastructure, and maritime security represent an attempt to build a positive agenda around which like-minded nations can cohere, rather than simply a reactive coalition defined by what it opposes. The AUKUS agreement, announced in September 2021, was more militarily explicit. The United States and the United Kingdom agreed to help Australia acquire nuclear-powered submarines, not nuclear-armed, but nuclear-propelled, giving them a range and endurance that diesel-electric submarines cannot match. The strategic logic was transparent. Australia, with nuclear-powered submarines, could project power across the vast distances of the Indo-Pacific, sustaining a presence in waters where Chinese naval power was growing at historically unprecedented speed. The announcement triggered a diplomatic crisis with France, which had been in the final stages of a multi-billion-dollar submarine deal with Australia that was abruptly canceled. The French fury. Paris recalled its ambassadors from Washington and Canberra, illustrated the transaction costs of building a more coherent Indo-Pacific security architecture. Managing alliances, including the sensitivities and occasional contradictions of democratic partners, is vastly more complex than the Chinese system of relationships, which rests more directly on economic leverage and bilateral deals. NATO, the Atlantic Alliance, has also been drawn into the China competition in ways that would have seemed implausible a decade ago. At the 2022 NATO summit in Madrid, the alliance's strategic concept, its foundational document, named China as a systemic challenge for the first time. Japan and South Korea attended NATO summits as partners. European NATO members, shaken by Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 and by the evidence that authoritarian great powers were willing to use military force to redraw borders, began to reassess their economic dependencies on China with a new urgency. The concept of de-risking, reducing European exposure to Chinese supply chains and economic leverage in critical sectors, gained wide acceptance in Brussels, Berlin, and Paris, even as Europe was careful to distinguish de-risking from full decoupling. The Ukraine war reshaped the strategic landscape in ways that directly affected the American approach to China. Russia's invasion demonstrated that great power war in the 21st century was not only possible, but horrifyingly real. It demonstrated the importance of industrial capacity for sustaining a prolonged conventional conflict, a lesson with direct implications for Taiwan. It revealed the effectiveness of Western economic sanctions as a strategic instrument, but also their limitations. Russia had not collapsed under the weight of sanctions, and the war had demonstrated that resource-rich, autarkic powers could sustain themselves longer than many in the West had assumed. Perhaps most importantly, the close coordination between Moscow and Beijing. The no-limits partnership announced by Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin just weeks before the invasion confirmed for many American strategists that the Chinese and Russian challenges were connected, and that the United States was in a period of simultaneous great power competition on two fronts. The Global South added a third dimension of complexity to American strategy. Many of the world's developing nations, in Africa, Latin America, South and Southeast Asia, were not prepared to align themselves with either Washington or Beijing. They had their own interests, their own histories, and their own ambivalence about the great power contest being waged partially on their territory. China's Belt and Road Initiative, launched in 2013, had built ports, railways, highways, and power plants across dozens of developing countries, creating economic relationships and, critics argued, strategic leverage. American strategists recognized that China was competing not merely in the military and technology domains, but in the domain of global development finance, and that the United States and its allies had for decades ceded that terrain. The Biden administration's response was the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, a G7 initiative announced in 2022 with a stated goal of mobilizing $600 billion in infrastructure investment for the developing world by 2027. Critics noted that the figure was aspirational and that the institutional mechanisms for achieving it were underdeveloped. Supporters argued that even an imperfect Western alternative to the Belt and Road would provide developing nations with a genuine choice rather than a single option. The contest for the allegiance of the Global South played out through infrastructure deals, vaccine diplomacy, educational scholarships, and the accumulated credibility of decades of engagement, is one of the less visible but potentially decisive theaters of the broader American-Chinese competition. As the middle of the 2020s approached, the shape of American strategy toward China had crystallized around several interlocking elements. Maintaining military superiority in the Indo-Pacific primarily through strengthened alliances and forward deployments. Controlling the technology frontier, particularly in semiconductors and artificial intelligence, through export controls and domestic investment. Rebuilding industrial capacity at home through legislation like the CHIPS and Science Act of 2022 and the Inflation Reduction Act, building a coalition of like-minded nations to contest Chinese influence in the developing world, and deterring military action against Taiwan through a combination of arms sales, military exercises, and the doctrine of strategic ambiguity. Whether this strategy will succeed, whether it is internally coherent, adequately resourced, and capable of sustaining democratic support over the years and decades required, remains the central unanswered question of the era. The engagement strategy failed slowly and then all at once. The competition strategy will be tested in ways that no strategist can fully predict. What is certain is that the outcome will determine the character of the world that the next generation inherits.